Welcome back to another episode of Just
Just
a
a squirrel
Squirrel Looking
looking
for a
for a
Nut,
nut,
trying
trying
to
to
get
get
out
out
of
of
this
this
rut.
rut. We
Not
have it
bad.
not bad at all. And you know what else is not bad? In fact, it is quite wonderful to see. It is Jessica Dugas in the room. Jessica,
That
let me just begin by saying how much I
is one
appreciate
thing we
seeing
probably
you.
wouldn't change, right? Is
Never. I
Jessica
would
showing
never
up.
want that to change. How are you, Jessica? And Oleg, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing very well. I'm excited for this. Always excited to connect with you, Scott, and Jessica, and anyone else, because I think these conversations for me, have profound meaning, and they allow me to just expand my perspective even more about whatever the subject is. So it's always a joy to be a part of these.
I love the depth and the substance. Today's topic is about if it's really asking a question: if there's one thing in our lives that we could change, what would it be? And Jessica says she would change how closed she am in proximity to us both because she really needs a hug today. Jessica, I would give you a hug too. I know I would change that as well. And whatever it is that you need a hug for, understand that we are there with you in spirit, and
Mhm.
cyber hugs and spiritual hugs or whatever other sort of hug you need, you should understand and feel like it's there for you. Kim Schultz, welcome. It is good to see you too. And you know what? Just because you're you, we'd have a hug coming in your direction as well. If there was one thing in my life I could change, this answer might shift as the show
Mhm.
goes on, Oleg. But I'll start by saying, if there's one thing in my life that I could change, it would probably have been going to law school. On the one hand, it brought me a level of intellectual and rigor, and it brought me a level of credibility that is huge, and an ability to think things through critically and with consequences always at the forefront. And so, and in a way that's logical and is able to parse apart the very different components of a situation or a problem that might be in front of me. So I won't say that it had no benefit, but the circumstances under which I went, my parents were of an old school. It really wasn't them. It was they were sort of speaking as to a lot of the thinking at the time, which is that if you don't go out of college and get your professional degree right away, you could be lured away by the desire by making money in business or retail or whatever it was that you were working in an auto shop, whatever it was that you might be doing, and then never getting around to getting that additional higher level of education, which could credentialize you and provide you with an additional level of authority and security in the world. And I bought into that. It was a mistake because I didn't have an intrinsic love for the law.
Hmm.
I didn't necessarily have a desire to be, I didn't understand what being a lawyer really, really would look like day to day. I didn't have an understanding of what it meant. I didn't have a deep enough understanding of who I was to really be able to say this was the right choice for me. Now, if going to law school had been a lower stakes adventure, maybe it wouldn't have mattered as much. But it was 3 years of my life. And even at the time when I went, which was a not insignificant amount of time ago, I left with well over $100,000 worth of debt. I was paying $1,500 to $1,800 a month in student loan fees, not counting my rent, not counting
Mhm.
food, not counting the amount of hours that you spend as a lawyer, and particularly as a junior lawyer. And so, with those hours consuming so much of my life, I also had an opportunity cost, which was not figuring out who and what I am and what I was. I was just so consumed doing the next task. And so, if there's one thing that in my life that I would change, my off the cuff answer is and has been ever since I left law school that was it. I would have, at a minimum, deferred my admission for a year or two. maybe not even applied at all, but just really dug down and maybe doing something like you're about to do, travel for a
Hmm.
while, or maybe work at a low paid or medium paid job, but have the time to think. And I will also say that that's the dominant mode of thinking that I've been in for the past however many years. But by the end of this conversation, it's entirely possible that my feelings may change. Jessica, Kim, if there's one thing that right now, at this point in the conversation, you would change in your life, I would love if you, and anyone else watching, whether now, and I know we have people that watch this after the fact, if you want to put that in the comments, I would love to hear this as conversation starters. And perhaps at the end, we could circle back and see whether anything has changed. Oleg, what is your answer to the question of the day?
What was your childhood profession? What did you want to be when you were growing up?
I didn't really know.
Hmm.
I remember I watched Star Trek and I thought that communication sounded good because I enjoyed talking. And, I didn't really relate to Lieutenant Uhura because she was a female and all of that, but being able to go to other planets and all, right, like that seemed pretty cool. I thought for a while, maybe I would want to be a pro wrestler. What was I thinking? I
Hmm.
thought for a while that I would want to be a writer. I thought for a while that being a book critic would be fun, or a music critic. I thought that being a music producer would be cool. Being the popular producer at the time was Giorgio Moroder or one of these people like that. I thought that being like a professional runner
Mm.
could have been cool too. Because
Hmm.
that I was actually really good at.
Hmm.
So
The only reason why I asked that is because I find it fascinating how those childhood dreams, for some, have turned out to be exactly what it is that they end up pursuing in today's day and age. But for others, it's not always in alignment. For me, when I was younger, there were a couple of things that I wanted to become. First, an astronaut.
oh wow.
I was fascinated by being able to go into space to explore new territory. The other one I remember vividly was a firefighter, being able to put out fires. And I think at the core of it, in a way, I might have achieved elements of it, and that's being able to help people regardless of what the circumstances may be. But as I think about this question and as I relate it back to my own journey, I was thinking about it actually prior to this conversation taking place. And I think first thing that I've come to terms with, and this is something that you, as well as Casey and Jessica and so many other people have helped me reframe about my own past, and that is, to be completely honest with you, I wouldn't change a single thing about my past or my circumstances. And the reason why I say that is because I think I believe that I had to go through the things that I had to go in order to not only develop as a person, but also develop this methodology that I choose to live my life according to. I think if there was anything that I were to change, it is something that I started to change recently in the past 5 to 6 to maybe 8 months, and that's the desire to travel. I know for me, for many years, I set many limitations upon myself as far as why I felt that I couldn't travel in that given time or in that given moment. Some of it had to do with the common stories that I'm sure people hear, and that's you don't have enough money to experience world travel, you don't have the time, you have all the responsibilities at home. How can you make it work with your profession or your job? And then I started to realize that the more that I chose to challenge my own limitations, the more the story started to unfold and present to me as this is possible. You can go travel the world and experience all of these different things, and you can do it responsibly. It doesn't necessarily have to be something where I go off the grid and the squirrels and anyone else never sees me again. But it's more so it's just something that I chose to experience. So for me, when I think about that one thing for me is continuing to challenge my own limiting beliefs, my own limitations of I can't do this or it's not the right time. Well, the reality of the matter is, at least what I've learned, is that the timing is never perfect. there's always something standing in the way. There's always a quote unquote better circumstance or a better situation or a better group of people to surround myself with. But I just realized it's like I life it's beautiful, and I think what it has given me is this opportunity to be open-minded and know that a change is inevitable. So why don't I become a participant of it rather than being an observer and letting change happen for me and then ultimately becoming the victim of the circumstances?
Jessica and Kim raise similar points
Mm-hmm.
in a respect. And I'd like to explore those. Jessica's point in particular, thank you for the squirrel and the rabbit hole reference, Jessica. I love the cleverness that you always bring into the room here.
That is the
Is
theme of our show.
it is it absolutely, again, that's why we love you so much. One of the negative things in the world are necessary for us to appreciate and learn lessons. And then Kim similarly says, and Kim, your confidence is something that I think is so special. I was listening to our podcast again the other day, and I was really just your energy, the vibrance, and the willingness to just say whatever comes to your mind really stood out. And the reason I mention that is that it's right in your post this very second. I am who I am today, and though my past wasn't easy, and my present isn't exactly where I thought it would be. Oh, and my present, isn't exactly where I thought it would be. Changing things wouldn't ensure that it works better. So you are both saying that the past is a necessary predicate for the future.
Mm-hmm.
The pushback that I have about that is that it is always easy for us to say, and I say this respectfully. I'm not saying it purely to be argumentative. Maybe I am, but these two people of all people are more than capable of taking me on. So one of the pushbacks that I have about that is that it is perhaps easy for us to say when we're coming from a place where the mistakes that we've made or the past decisions that we could change if we, or that we would change if we could, haven't put us into such a position where we are in desperate, even potentially fatal situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I will not deal with fatal. We can all imagine that. We can read the newspapers, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about desperate situations. I'll share a story. And there's a friend I had, and I may have told this story before. She had a crush on she was a nerdy, smart girl in high school, and she had a crush on the school's top basketball player. And he didn't know she existed. He was good looking, he was tall. Everyone wanted to be around him. She would smile at him and try and flirt, but he wasn't going to go for the class geek. It just wasn't going to happen. Anyway, they both graduated and went on with their lives. And one day she got into the subway here in New York City. And when she walked down into it, as is well publicized, there are always homeless people in New York City. I will stand up for my home city for any of you who may doubt. There's not homeless people in camps all over the city threatening people or smelling up every sidewalk. It's not like that. But it is, as in every city, there are homeless people. And in the subway, she saw one of them, their little water, like when there are little drain pipes that come out so the water can drain if it goes through and somehow goes down into the system. And you saw some of those drain pipes get overloaded in the recent footage from the floods that were here in the subways. But usually it's not that bad. And she saw someone bathing and cleaning himself with the water from one of these pipes. And something just made her stare at this man. And after a while, she realized that this filthy homeless person that was cleaning himself naked in this, using the water from the pipes, drainage pipes in the subway, was this high school guy that she had known. That's a desperate situation to be in. If you're a single male in New York City who's homeless and living in the subway system and cleaning yourself there, the chances are you have a drug problem or a severe mental illness. And so I will assume he had a drug problem. That's likely what it was. Well, Can we really say I'm in a horrible situation now? I'm a drug addict. I could freeze to death if the temperature tomorrow night goes below blah, blah, or I could lose my toes, or I could be hit by a subway when I'm cleaning myself, or I could be attacked and literally thrown under the tracks and be electrocuted by the third rail, or these other horrible things that happen to homeless people. Would any of us really say, if we were living that sort of desperate life, that I wouldn't change anything about my past, that I wouldn't, if I didn't have those, I wouldn't be learning from my mistakes?
Well, I think in the moment it's difficult to say. So I can relate to my own circumstances and the things that I grew up in for the first 12 or 9 to 12 years of my life. And I can't say that I've experienced exactly what anyone else is experiencing, but I have experienced circumstances that might be similar to it. And what I will say from my own experience and perspective is that in the moment, it would have been very challenging for me to accept this open-minded perspective that things could be different, that the things that I'm going through are serving a purpose. Absolutely. Knowing what I know now, that is literally the only thing that I do choose to accept, is that whatever the circumstances that are presented in front of me, I wholeheartedly believe that there is a lesson that I'm here to learn. Now, whether or not that is a lesson that I choose to learn, or that is a lesson that I do learn within a given time frame, that part I can't control. So I guess what it makes me think of is this: is I think that, in my opinion, information such as the information presented by the past is solely there to provide you options, but it is not there to provide you with a sense of destiny. So I think when I think about that final destination, I think that that destination gets formed through a series of decisions. I think it also gets formed through how I choose to interpret the meaning of all of these events. Kim brought up a really good point, which I think relates exactly to what you have described, and that is, she was talking about some of the people whose life that she wanted to, or she aspired for, and she said they have the husband, the family, nice house, money, and yet lacking confidence and happiness. I think the same exact thing applies to what you just shared, Scott, and that is, there are certain circumstances that get presented in front of us in life. I believe that we have the choice of how we interpret those circumstances. Now, I'll also say that the change is not instant. When I'm experiencing X, Y, and Z, and as much as I aspire for that thing to change and to see the other side of it all, it doesn't happen like that sometimes. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years. Think about the number of years it took you to get to this particular point where you were able to confidently share different elements of your own journey.
Mm-hmm.
And you might still feel certain things from, whether it's the external criticism or the judgment from other people or whatever it is, that may prevent you from sharing certain things, but yet you still do it. So I guess for me, what I choose to say in regard to what you just shared, Scott, and what everyone else is sharing in the comments, is that I believe there's a choice. But the only reason why I believe there's a choice is because I was able to make it a choice. Is that choice possible for everyone? Is it accessible for everyone? I have no idea. Maybe, maybe not. And I don't know if there's necessarily even knowing an answer to that question, because I know that there were times throughout my own life where I was in different situations where I didn't feel that there was a choice. But yet, through just interacting with other people, through certain beliefs that people have instilled in me, I started to believe that there was one at the end of the day. But that's just a personal belief. I don't think that's necessarily a universal one.
Jessica and Kim are having an interesting back and forth through all of this around some social service related issues that the whole desperate situation rose up. And I want to make sure that we hold on to those. They're not being disregarded. I'm really processing them personally. And I worked in social services myself, as did you, Kim, for some time. And so I really am excited about the conversation turning in that direction. And Jessica, in particular, I appreciate your vulnerability and openness here. Howard, I want to welcome you to the show and say thank you so much for coming, and appreciate your comment about the value of the conversation that we're having here. Please feel free to contribute, because we love hearing what folks have to say. Now, and then Kim, you should have stalked Keanu Reeves more. I agree. In fact, you should have just married him. Okay, just marry him next time. The good news is, at age 59 or whatever, however old he is, he still looks pretty damn good.
And
So
the,
he's got probably at least another 30 years to still be a viable husband.
and the great news on top of that, it's still not too late.
It's never too late. Hey, I went to a gay pride rally in the 90s, and this woman said, I'm 103 years old. I came out when I was 99. It's never too late. Yeah.
So it is still possible to find him, and it is still possible to
Hey.
stalk him.
Now, I want to just briefly, before we move on to the whole Jessica and Kim back and forth, and it was not a hostile back and forth. It was a very enlightened, interesting back and forth that's really substantive. I wanted to just say that this idea of looking back, I wouldn't change anything, and everything is choice, choice, choice. I guess the one question I have is, can you really say that if a situation is such that where you make one choice, where you make one mistake and you pay forever?
Well, what I will say to that is, and once again, this is not necessarily a something that we argue over, but more so this is just us sharing our perspectives. Yeah. So what I've been able to learn in the recent years is that, if anything, this concept that there's this one choice, there's one situation, there's one event, I believe it's an aspiration. I think it is something that I choose to think that there's one thing, but the reality of the matter is, if you really think about it, it's never just a single choice. It's never just a single event. It's never just a single situation. It's a series of events and a series of choices that led to that particular instance. So I guess for me, as a way to answer a question with a question, is how could you ever have enough confidence in that if you were to change the final straw at the end of that, or the final strain or whatever it is at the end of it, that you'll be able to change the circumstances itself, when the reality of the matter is it might have been a decision that had happened hundreds of decisions prior to that you weren't even aware of. I mean, think about the times where you might have found yourself in difficult situations when it comes to finances, right? The one that you can recall is maybe when the bank called you and say, hey, you have X number of dollars in your bank account, or you have overdraft fees, or whatever. That's not ultimately the final choice that I would change about it, but it's more so maybe a series of choices, hundreds or thousands beforehand, where maybe I should have paid attention to my parents more. Maybe I should have sat in that class that was talking about financial literacy and different ways to save and prepare for these future outcomes and situations. So I guess for me, what I find difficult is trying to figure out what is that one choice, when the reality of the matter is it's hundreds, if not thousands, of choices that led to that moment.
Well, because that's not always true. You, for instance, may...
Well, give me an example.
Sure, I'll give you two examples. For instance, the movie 12 Years a Slave is a perfect example. Like, he got captured, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. So like, he might legitimately say, yeah, I made a choice to, right? He was a musician. I made a choice to go home alone, go home after my musician gig was over. But who was not going to make that choice realistically? What is he going to stay play musician forever on the off chance that he won't get kidnapped? So there's that sort of thing where really, or what Jessica mentioned earlier, health. You can't always control what your health is. And so you may not be in a position, you may say, well, if there's anything that I could change in my life, it would be that I didn't have this rare genetic disorder that I didn't ask for and if you have multiple sclerosis, for instance, you don't make a choice to get MS. And then the other situation is one in which there was a hobby that people engaged in New York City in the 2000s called subway surfing. And what would happen, it was teenagers that would do this, of course, usually teenage boys.
Mm-hmm.
And they would hop on the top of subways, usually to impress their girlfriends or their friends of subway cars, and ride them. The only problem is, unbeknownst to them, the subway system has in the tunnels these concrete slabs that come down randomly just right above the subway car. So some of these boys would hop on this thing not knowing these slabs were there, and then ram at the full speed of a subway into this concrete thing. Now, they died, of course, instantly. Like, that's the sort of thing where, really, was that this culmination of a number of choices in your life, or did you just make a really bad decision that day?
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the situations that we're talking about. Kim and Jessica, thank you for letting us know, by the way, that you can't see each other on the stream. Yeah, ouch. That's one way to put it. There's an account in the newspapers of the girlfriend of one of these boys. He saw the thing coming. He looked at her with a look of terror in his eyes. And then, yeah, the big ouch came. Horrible. But and Jessica does say, and maybe that's true, not just your choices, but the choices of others.
Yeah.
That's a loaded one. Melody.
But
Melody. Welcome.
it's true, and I think, well, I don't know what is true, so let's unpack it that way, right? Because I think there's just so much that is just too complicated or too complex to even explore. Because even in the first case, when you're talking about that film, which, by the way, is an exceptional film, I watched it probably 3 to 4 times by now.
Yeah.
And the story of, for those that haven't seen it, we won't spoil the movie for you, but it's essentially this guy, forgot his name. What's his name?
I don't remember either.
But he plays the cello, violin.
Yeah, something.
Violin, and one day he gets captured by a group of people who then take him to essentially a plantation where he has to work for the remainder of his life. But in that case, I think you're absolutely right, as far as that's not a choice that he had made for himself, but rather it was a choice that was made for him due to the times that were experienced in the States. Now, leading up to that choice, what actually created the slavery to begin with? I mean, that's a series of choices. That's hundreds, if not thousands, of choices that led up to that particular moment. Yeah. And then prior to that, what were the choices that were made in order to create that particular methodology that it's okay for people to be a source of property and not be acknowledged for the human beings that they are? So that's where I think I was more so hinting at, is that it's difficult. Yes, there's some of these situations that you could say, okay, personally speaking, if I didn't make this choice, I wouldn't end up in those situations. But at the same time, then there's also the other part of that puzzle, and that is sometimes the choices are made for you by other individuals or by your circumstances or by your environment. And so I guess that for me is a little bit, I find it more challenging. Like, well, yes, I could change this, but at the same time, what would it actually take in order for change that? Is it solely for me to make that event disappear, or is it for other people to change their own decision making and the choices that they're presented with?
Yeah. Now, I will say, even in that movie, choice actually comes up in a couple of ways. And then I want to get back to some of this stuff earlier that Jessica and Kim, they couldn't see each other, but they were actually inadvertently having a great dialogue back and forth. About 12 Years a Slave, there is it's a scene that's haunted me. Because I don't know if it's maybe I can empathize too much with those in the scene. He's working in the field, and there's a man that collapses just from heat exhaustion. And then the next scene is his funeral, and this northern captured slave, who's the protagonist, the other slaves are singing a Negro spiritual, wishing him, the dead slave, goodbye. And actually, because of this fact that this sort of thing actually sort of happened, it is very difficult for me to even think about. But he is at this funeral, and then he finds himself almost against his will beginning to sing the spiritual. And symbolically, that was his choice to accept himself as a slave. And that is
I didn't even
Perhaps
think about it that way.
that's how I took that scene. And that was, to me, the only
Solomon. That's the guy's name.
yeah, it's the only conceivable reason why I could think that that scene was actually in the film. And it was a turning point until later he sort of saw an opportunity to leave. But there was, it goes as to sometimes the choice is resignation, and whether that reflects a lesson that's learned or not. Jessica, I'm going to go back to what you said earlier, and if anyone wants to comment about this scene and their thoughts about it, I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because I always wondered, at what point would I resign myself to my fate? Now, Jessica mentioned that she was in a situation where she had to leave her home due to a terrible, unfamiliar situation. Right. And it's there in the comments, so I won't repeat it. But that is an interesting thing. She says she wouldn't change it. Kim, around the same time, added a comment that she worked with homeless people and that they were making, on some level or another, what you describe as excuses really are, at least as I'm interpreting this, Kim, and disagree with me if I'm wrong, are choices that one may not be wanting to take accountability for, and displacement of responsibility. And then Jessica talks, thank you very much, Oleg. I'll let this comment speak for itself, but I feel like it is sort of a statement as to how we live through them feeling and coming out of it. Right? Like, to me, that's how I'm interpreting what you do with it, and the lessons that you can take from something that may or may not have been within your ability to change, or that you only had a limited ability to change. I'm making the best decision, or I'm doing the best that you can in that time. Maybe that actually is tying back to that 12 years a slave scene. Maybe he was just making the best that he could at the time.
Out of the circumstances.
Yeah.
But
resignation maybe for him was all that he could do.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's important to point out, and I don't know if you share this perspective, Scott, or Melody, or Kim, or Jessica, or anyone else that's tuning in right now, but what I've learned is that in order for the lessons to be learned, it oftentimes takes place from a hindsight perspective. So being able to look back at the circumstances and process the different lessons, the takeaways, and all the things. For me, very rarely has it happened in the moment, especially when it comes to some of the more difficult situations that I've encountered within my life. I mean, not necessarily going back to my childhood years, but in the recent years. And that would be to certain relationships, certain friendships, dissolving for whatever reason. And I realized that it was only moments after, or sometimes a significant time after, that I was able to reflect upon it and see the different things that I've learned from those situations. So I guess my point being there is that that lesson, or the ability to articulate a lesson, is not always present in the moment itself. So I think the mindset that Jessica shared, and that is just literally making the best out of the circumstances and going through the moment, that's something that I've been able to do also, while understanding that that lesson may not be present to me until whatever time down the road.
Well, Kim's comment about her experiences working with the homeless puts an interesting wrinkle in that. In that what Kim is suggesting is, at least as I'm taking it, Kim, is that we can never get to the place where we learn from these things that we can or can't change if we never actually take accountability for how we react to them. As opposed to, right, because they may have been, and I don't want to, I'll go back to the 12 years a slave example. He may or may not have had an actual choice about being a slave, and it probably was the decisions, or certainly was the decisions of others, that set up the whole institution of slavery. And there were a whole number of decisions that were made about why African Americans ended up being, they should not have been, but how they ended up being slaves in particular, and that he had no control over whatsoever. perhaps hidden underneath that scene was an acknowledgement that he was making a choice about what he was going to be in the future under those circumstances. So the
Yes.
choice was constrained, and he chose that particular path.
Well, I think it also brings up another point within that. And once again, by no means am I endorsing what happened or on the side of what took place as far as slavery goes. But I'm also curious when it comes to some of these situations in life. And I know we've talked about this on previous episodes, but what if those were the set of circumstances that he was meant to go through in order to be able to impact the world that he's able to do it today? I mean, really think about that. That film alone, based on that story, what kind of perspective did it add to your life, to my life, to anyone
Well,
else,
so yeah, the lives of millions of people
the
that saw
lives
it.
of millions of people, not only in that neighborhood or those towns, but around the world. So that's where I think there's this concept of, and I guess this goes back to control, thinking that I somehow control the outcome or I even have control over that one thing that I could change, when the reality of the matter is maybe there are certain situations or events that are presented in front of us with a larger purpose that we may or may not be able to articulate in the moment.
Melody says the bigger the struggle, the bigger the purpose.
That could also be true. Like,
Jessica, yeah, I mean that's interesting. There's some Jessica has a good point about releasing expectations of understanding the lesson. I probably need to do that sometimes.
mhm.
There was on my podcast, this episode hasn't aired yet, but I interviewed a woman named Anne Marie Mull. And Anne Marie Mull has a master's in divinity from Harvard University. So she's obviously not dumb as a rock, to say the very least. And one of the things that came up during this conversation was the concept of vanished people. And vanished people are vanished civilizations that came and went, and we know nothing about at all.
Mhm.
Maybe we have some archaeological records, but they're the sort of archaeological records where the archaeologists are like, okay, these ruins are here. We have no idea who these people are. We have no way of translating their any writings that they had, or maybe they had no writings whatsoever. We have no idea what these stone structures meant. We have no idea why the city was even here. We don't know anything about these people except there are some rocks here that were obviously put by human beings.
Have there been quite a few?
There have been, but not only that, you think about this in other contexts, and this is the context that she brought it up in. There were entire nations of Native Americans, for instance, that vanished. That because they didn't necessarily build these stone structures, we don't even have that much of a record of. Maybe a mention in passing in some tribal narratives. Or we think about those that may have, civilizations that may have come and gone, not necessarily in America, but just simply parts of the world that we haven't really explored, or where they didn't need or didn't make sense for them to set up the sort of archaeological structures that would survive time. And so they simply may have left no record of themselves. And that raises an interesting question for me, because when we're talking about, well, we don't know the impact of any struggle or any action or any decisions that we make on the larger picture. Well, what if you're one of these? What if the struggle that you went through, or what if the decisions that you made were all part of this? You were a vanished people. You're gone. Who and what you were in your civilization, your entire milieu. There's no record of it. So is there even a possibility of that longer term meaning for you?
I guess you could also make an argument that who's to say we're not part of that civilization?
Well, that was an interesting part of the discussion.
And who's to say that how long that information gets passed from one civilization to another? That's a question. I'm glad that you brought that up, because this is a question that I've been pondering upon for quite some time, and that is, how long does information about any particular civilization goes on? Who determines the life? I suppose it's us as people who are still alive that get to determine the life of certain events, but at the same time, I mean, even think about the history that we either have experienced ourselves or are somewhat connected to. We, I think many people that I've come across are aware of, let's say, World War II. Very few people are aware of World War One. That wasn't that much of a time between them. What, only 30 years?
If that long.
If that long. So and then beyond that, I can't name you many people that know the war that happened before that. So it's just interesting to me to kind of know this pattern of which events and which civilizations get to have continued meaning and life passed down from one generation to another, and then which of them don't.
Jessica says she's going to go to Harvard now, by the way.
Do you think Scott, do you think that there are parts of the world that we have not explored just yet?
Of course. We don't know what there's entire civilizations that were submerged underneath the seas. Islands that due to volcanism were just covered and we can never get to. One of the things that Anne Marie Mall and Melody, by the way, had a retort to me, just because we don't see it doesn't mean that they didn't share a purpose. So that is a pretty forthright comeback. I would say one of the things that we discussed during this podcast episode that is yet to be aired about it is, she said, look, the chances are we're the vanished people. We just don't realize it yet. And when I thought about this later, I really actually think it makes sense. She inspired me to buy a book that I just got in the mail yesterday about the great extinctions that have occurred during the history of our planet. So there have been a lot of other vanished species. But in our case,
what's the name?
It's called The End of the Worlds, I think. It's about the 5 great mass extinctions. But in any event, for instance, one of the things that I've read once is that the Roman civilizations ruined and survived because the ruins, and Egyptian too, for that matter, survived because they were made out, things that they did were made out of stone. And stone doesn't rust. Stone doesn't rot. Now, eventually, even things like the Parthenon and the pyramids erosion will take them away unless they're covered with sand. But generally, that takes a much longer time, particularly if they're in an arid environment where there's not a lot of rain. But how do we construct buildings? We construct them out of glass and steel and wood. Well, wood rots faster than anyone can say anything. Steel rusts. And glass is hardly something that will last forever. Plastic might last. So maybe we won't totally vanish because some other species millions of years down the road will discover all this plastic junk that we left floating around in trash cans everywhere. But they wouldn't have maybe any understanding of who we were or what that meant. Who knows? Maybe pressure, maybe it's more erosible than people realize, and we could vanish. I mean, her point was that we're not setting ourselves up as a species to especially modern people, to be exactly anything other than vanished.
So I guess for me, then the question becomes, going back to the theme of the episode, and that is, if you could change one thing in your life, what would it be? If you could change one thing about that element of history, as far as civilizations that have gone vanished, would you do it? And if so, what additional meaning would it provide to you now?
Yeah, maybe some ironclad rule that civilizations just couldn't completely vanish. Even if they died, they would have to leave something behind that we could understand. Right? Like that's some immutable law of nature, that something just changes inside the brain, so that's what every civilization could do. And I do think that could change our future. Now, it may or may not, it changes in ways that are unpredictable, as someone said earlier. I think it would be really interesting because there'd be so much knowledge that we might have.
And so what does that give us? Does that give us greater hope for the future? The fact that our species could survive, as well as possibly transforming to
Well,
another species?
boy, Casey, this would be a great question for him because he might say no. That would my immediate argument is that we would not have been held back by the lack of knowledge. If there was more knowledge, it would be more likely to aggregate. But he might say that, and I'm not speaking for him, but he might say, well, all that might do is hasten our destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Because technology is what's putting us in the position where we could utterly destroy ourselves. One thing, again, I don't want to give away this whole episode, but for instance, we end up...
And certainly don't give away the end of life for all of us.
Yeah, I won't. But one thing that's interesting, definitely.
End of the world.
Or maybe we do, right. But one of the things that she says very graphically is we're all living in a sandbox here. She talks about climate change. Now, if you're a kid, sometimes you go poo-poo. And you go poo-poo in the sandbox. Do you want to clean up the poo-poo? Or do you want to just let the poo-poo pile up and roll around in it? And so perhaps the aggregation of knowledge would have given us additional insight into some of these problems that we're having now that we're not coming to resolution on. Or maybe that knowledge would have gotten us to a position where we were poo-pooing earlier and earlier and earlier and drowning or already extinct because of all the you-know-what that we're putting out into the world.
Well, that just added a whole new perspective to my childhood times of playing in the sandbox, to say the least.
It's important to every now and then talk about human release.
Maybe the thing that I chewed on wasn't sand. But it's an interesting point. At least I find it interesting because you don't know. The other part that I think it's interesting about that particular point that you had made is that we assume that we would be able to use that information in the correct way and to the best of our ability for the benefit of the future. But I think going back to an earlier remark, I don't remember if it was Kim or Jessica that had made it, and that is, just because that information is available, it doesn't mean that is necessarily going to be an accurate prediction of what may or may not take place moving forward. Yes, we might know what has caused some of these extinctions, but at the same time, if all of them were so rare that there's really no common pattern besides the only thing that's being common is the fact that they went extinct, well, what's the point? What is the point of information? And that goes back to, I think, ties into the theme of the episode, and that is, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And I find that to be interesting when it comes to the past. If you could change one thing about the past, whatever the circumstances, even the past hour, if you could change one thing that you might have said or you might have thought, what does that give you as far as a prediction for the future or a certainty of the future?
I've got two things to say.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, Melody, if there's anything in your life you'd like to change, we're all sharing today things in our life that we would like to change or not.
Mm-hmm.
Jessica and Kim have done that, and Oleg and I have done that. If you're in the mood, feel free to type that in there. One thing perhaps that I would change that I wasn't thinking about at the top of the hour is the t-shirt that I'm wearing.
Yeah, you should change it. Me too. My question is, what would you change it to?
Something gold that I need to email Kim and Jessica about.
I love it. I actually have it. That might be a t-shirt we want to highlight here.
I think so.
perfect alignment to Jessica's remark. Would there be consequences?
Yeah. I will say, if Spectrum were not making those T-shirts that employ and give real employment to people on the autistic spectrum that otherwise would not have the opportunity to work, there would be really negative consequences.
Yeah.
There's a great point. Would there be consequences, Jessica asks. And boy, are there even decisions that we can make, or would there ever be changes that would have no consequences? I always wonder that. Like, are there things that we do that really just have no consequences?
Well, isn't a consequence just a matter of you? Well, I guess it's not. Now, let me take it back. Because I guess what I was about to say is that the consequence is simply the meaning that you choose to create out of the events, but that's not even always true. Because I don't know, I think every decision does have a consequence. I don't think a consequence is necessarily a negative thing. I think a consequence could be a positive thing. You and I choosing to get on a phone, spend however long talking to each other, learning about each other's backgrounds and aspirations. From there, the consequence that we had experienced of that phone call is ongoing collaboration.
Okay, here's an example, and I bet people will have some feeling states about this. But before I go any further, Melody, next week, if you finish your article, whenever you finish your article, be sure to just put a link to it in our comments sometime so that people can link to it. I see it on LinkedIn or Facebook, one or the other, and I've read your articles. They were actually really good, and I appreciate being able to read them. You're a professional writer, so that's no surprise, though. Now, here's an example. Let's say I'm poor, and let's say I can't afford to buy music. So, and I can't afford Spotify or Pandora or whatever. So I just go to some Russian website that's harmless, but I just download it illegal, or I rip it off of YouTube.
Hey, why does it have to be Russian? I'm kidding.
Whatever, it's some website.
Yeah.
All right. Well, and you download it. And so does that action have consequences? What is the consequence? What? The artist hasn't lost money because you're too poor to have afforded to buy the music anyway. So the consequence is that the artist didn't lose any money. The consequence is that you're listening to a single song that you would have listened to anyway. You would have just played it over and over again on YouTube.
Well, yeah, I guess you could say that the artist doesn't lose any money, but it doesn't mean that that's the only metric that is being tracked. So there might be a metric that is tracked based on number of downloads. That might impact, I don't know, the popularity of that particular artist. Another consequence that I've personally experienced, because I have used services like that when I was younger, is a virus. That's a consequence I've experienced by downloading things from website that I was not aware of beyond that one particular encounter, and B, something that maybe I should have been more attentive to is not remembering that. Yeah, Napster or some of these other websites that provided things like that. So I guess for me, I personally can't think of a particular decision that I have lived through that didn't have a set of consequences, negative and positive.
Well, maybe before I started this show, I wanted to slick this hair back.
And you would have faced some consequences afterwards.
What? What's going to happen if I didn't slick a hair back?
Someone might have joined the show that did not like your hair the way it was.
Okay, so that's the question of the day. Do you all like my hair? Jessica, Kim, Melody, Oleg, anyone, do you accept my hair for what it is, slicked back or not? Kim says if she didn't, I misread something. Kim says if she didn't marry her abusive husband, she would not have her amazing daughter, and that is something that I wouldn't change because my daughter is awesome. The abuse allows her to help others. So it wasn't Right. If it wasn't for them, then you wouldn't be who you were today. That's really amazing. I always wonder about those circumstances. And one question that I have for Kim, Jessica, you both have said this, Melody, I'd be shocked if on some level or another you don't have something to, and Kim, or Jessica actually says high five, Kim. So she probably feels the same way about her own earlier relationship.
Yeah.
But, one thing that I've talked to my husband about is after nearly 20 years working for government, I was driven out. Basically, I wasn't fired or anything, but I was just like had my last straw and quit with a boss that was abusive.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to David about that, my husband, at length. And I said, looking back on it, if she had been nice, I might have been stuck there forever. I might still be working there right now. And he said, yeah, but Scott, one thing that I don't know that I want you to ever feel is grateful for her. Now, I don't know that he would oppose me feeling grateful for the way that my life has turned out, because he understands that I'm happy. But he felt pretty strongly showing gratitude for abuse was problematic. And I do not discount what he said there, because if we do show gratitude for abuse, we also, a consequence of that is we enable a culture where it can happen as an ongoing matter. Mm-hmm. And so I would love to know what folks think about that fine line. Like, do you still feel gratitude for the people, though, as much as they might have put these wonderful things into your life, despite being monsters? Are you on some levels grateful for them? Is it purely grateful gratitude for the outcome? How are you processing the decision that you're making that you wouldn't change because they brought you, in Kim's case, a child? How are you then processing your relationship with that individual and your feeling states towards whether you change it or not, whether that actually moves into gratitude for the situation? Mm-hmm. And Kim says she wouldn't be grateful, she would be accepting.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I was going to say. I think there's a big difference between choosing to be grateful and just choosing to accept the situation for what it is. And the other thing that I guess I'll say is that when it comes to certain people, I can't necessarily say that I'm grateful for some of the things that people go through in life, but at the same time, I've accepted that those are the things that people have gone through, and if anything, they do serve a purpose because they allow me to see whatever elements of it. I'm curious, before we one of the things that I've been curious about when it comes to this topic, Scott, so we've spent a pretty good portion of the hour talking about changing the one thing. The thing that I'm curious to hear your perspective as well as anyone else's is, what do you think makes change even possible?
I'll answer that. But Kim, I'm sorry, I just have to say this, Oleg, you really got me when Melody says grateful for what it taught. But Kim, what you said, the people who I'm helping because of the abuse might be grateful. That was actually kind of really deep. Mm-hmm. That one, wow. And then Jessica's thinking about the moments, and I guess even with this boss, I'm not grateful to her, but there were moments that were amazing and things that, yeah. So.
And if anything, like maybe from your case, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but maybe you're grateful for the perspective that you're able to walk away from. You're grateful for the opportunity to have a conversation with people who are literally sitting halfway across wherever about about a real life situation that took place that might have been painful in the moment, but at the same time, it might not necessarily bring lessons and takeaways to you, but it might allow someone else to do that. Someone else to articulate lessons and takeaways from similar circumstances in life.
I will say, even hearing this and thinking about what Kim said, I am grateful for the sense of loss that I had when that happened, because my identity, I felt, was gone. And this boss attempted to blackball me, I later found out. And so, but because of that, I have empathy for people. And when people talk about their life situations involving job shifts or getting fired or switching careers, and then I'm a lot more empathetic because of that. I hadn't
Hmm.
really thought about that before. Maybe the law school example, the one thing that I would change would have been going to law school. Well, maybe I'm more careful.
Hmm.
Maybe I've been able to help people that are thinking about going to law school and saying, look, don't make the mistake that I made in making that choice. Think carefully, or at least I'm presenting them with an option that they can consider that they might not consider otherwise. And they might be grateful or might not have ever heard that. And the consequences for them, if they had gone to law school, for all I know, could be far worse than mine. Look, I was able to craft a successful career despite not being happy in it. And all things considered, not being happy isn't the worst thing in the world. There's a
Hmm.
lot worse things, or at least not being happy in the job. There's a lot worse things out there than that.
And I
Um,
and the other thing that
yeah.
I'll add on to what you just shared, Scott, and that's something that I try to do within my own life, is that when it comes to situations and events, what I've tried to do is, as well as when I give advice to my own self, is not necessarily focus on that one particular event, but more so focus on the thought process that takes behind that event. Because it, as you just described, I mean, it's one thing to be able to have a conversation with someone where you tell them, don't ever go to law school. Well, the reality of the matter is you don't know the person, you don't know the experience that person is going to have. I can't tell you the number of times I've been told, don't go to this particular event, don't talk to this particular professor, don't talk to this particular individual, because they had a negative experience with that person. And that yet I would have it, and I would have a complete opposite. I would have the most positive, the most enriching experience. What is the difference between the two? I have no idea. Maybe the fact that I'm a different person, maybe the fact that I might have a different mindset, not necessarily any better or worse, it's just different. Or maybe the fact that the person that I met at that particular hour just happened to be experiencing a different set of circumstances compared to the circumstances that they were experiencing when they met you or whoever. And then from that point, they chose to be perceived as negative or whatever the situation is. So I find that that's also interesting, is that it's not necessarily about the thing itself, but it's more so what is the thought process that takes place leading up to that thing.
Mhm.
Like you said, choosing wisely.
I wanted to riff off briefly Jessica's 8:18 p.m. remark.
Adolf Hitler, I knew you would.
Yeah, and I'm not going to just answer that. I think it reminded me of another question though.
Hmm.
That example that you raised during that Saturday call, Jessica, reminds me of a story I heard. So many of you may not remember this. And I don't know to what extent it even made the national or international news. And Oleg, you almost certainly don't remember it. But in the 90s, I believe, or maybe early 2000s, there was a man who was crazy who got on the Long Island Railroad, which is a train that leaves there's a train system that leaves from New York City and goes out into the suburbs, and it brings millions of commuters into New York City and out of New York City every day. And basically, he got into this train and just started shooting people, and
Hmm.
a lot of people died. It was just this random thing, and allegedly there was a man who held this, the gunman was running to catch the train, and there was a man that held the door open for him, and so that's how this person got in, and then he ended up shooting people. However, what happened allegedly was that the gunman saw, as he was shooting people left and right, the man who held the door open for him, looked him in the eye and realized this was a man that held the door open for me, and then didn't shoot him. And it's sort of an opposite version of the question. Have we ever regretted, or would you ever change a decision in your life that was one made out of kindness or open heartedness or what was good inside?
It's a good question. I would say based on the things that I personally have experienced or witnessed, I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say I would regret any of them because I guess the reason why I say it is I don't know the decisions that anyone else would take after the decision that I chose to take. So there would almost be a level of responsibility that I would be taking for someone else's actions and accountability based on the decision that I made. So if I chose to be kind to you during this particular show, Scott, and you chose to do something completely different, and that is speak poorly of me, whether here or offline or whatever it is, I don't know how I could regret the decision that I had made in wanting to express gratitude and kindness and whatever else during this particular thing for the actions or the consequences that were presented by your decisions. So I guess for me, I wouldn't say that, but
Maybe
that's
being gracious or forgiving of a criminal who commits the act again. Like the employer saying, this convict of a violent crime, he's apparently redeemed himself while he was in prison, and so I'll hire him,
mm-hmm,
which is an act of generosity and openness. And then the man comes in and kills people.
mm-hmm.
Like, would you regret having hired him, which was an act of grace
But
and
how
kindness?
would you? But how would you know that? How would you know the series of decisions he
Yeah,
found
you
to
might
take?
say, well, you know what? Maybe I was weighing this wrong. Maybe my kindness wasn't occurring entirely in a vacuum. Maybe I was assessing kindness
Mm-hmm.
purely in terms of the individual that was in front of me and not thinking about kindness as keeping my employees safe from risk by having a convicted murderer amongst them.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe you're assessing it based on your own set of circumstances in life, and that is someone gave you a second chance, and third and fourth and fifth chance. So I think I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a complicated questions for a variety of reasons because especially when it comes to living things, I know for me it becomes a lot less about here's a checklist of things that I'm going to go through, and if they meet X, Y, and Z, then boom, they passed. Because some of the circumstances don't apply to a traditional checklist. Some of the situations are literally in the moment situations that take place. And even in that particular circumstance, let's say that you weren't the only one that was making that decision to hire someone like that. Let's say your whole team had to weigh in on that and they all saw almost exactly as you did. I don't know how you could, I'm not saying you can't regret a decision. I'm saying you could regret it. But for me, just knowing what I know now, I don't think I would regret it. Would I feel poorly about my decision? And I guess maybe that is somewhat tied to regret. Yeah, but that's because I would want to improve it. I would want to see what did I miss? What did I miss when it comes to this set of circumstances that may or may not be available for the next set of circumstances? But that also goes back to my own bias of wanting to grow and wanting to improve.
Melody agrees with you. She points out that what you've given that person is an opportunity to have a choice that they might not have made or been able to have otherwise. And Kim says, "Well, what if you didn't hire the ex-con, the ex-con killer, and he still came back and killed people? So it may not have had any impact at all, really,
Mm-hmm.
except on those individuals, right? It's just one set of individuals as a point, as opposed to another."
Mm-hmm.
I
And
just
what if
want,
that was the consequence? Like, how would you know?
yeah,
What if the consequences of what if that happened because you didn't choose to hire?
yeah.
So I guess at the end of the day, how I look at it is like regret. It's still a choice. You choose to regret certain things.
Melody's comment in particular goes as to something I really believe in the power of, although I often think it's irrational,
Mm-hmm.
which is hope.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I entered into this conversation with was hope. Hope that I would hear things or read things or experience things that changed my mind and it's caused me to grow. the things people said tonight really have done that for me.
Mm-hmm.
I said at the top of the hour that if I could change one thing in my life, for instance, it was going to law school right out of college. I realized as this conversation proceeded that maybe that isn't something that I would change. It's easy to sit back and say, I wish I'd done this differently, or I should have done this, or I could have, without doing the deeper dive into, well, really, what would consequences have been? What choices may or I may not have deprived people of? For all I know, thinking about this, the work that I did for the city, I hope that there were people that were helped because of it that might not have been helped if it wasn't me there, and might not have
Yeah.
cared about some. And so I think that part of the beauty of this, and this goes, Oleg, as to you and your insightfulness, but it also goes as to the participation of the brilliant minds that come back week after week and share here,
Mm-hmm.
that we change each other. And so I've reframed how I think about my whole law school experience because of you all. And I really want to express gratitude, because that's been a big thing that I've thought about and processed and felt a lot of regret and even anger about in my life. Thank you so much. Yeah, Kleenex was the sponsor of this episode. You all really, really went deep here.
Mm-hmm. And that is one thing, as I was even thinking about our conversation and many things, I know for me, when I came across the power that a space like this can create and the transformation and change that it can bring to people's lives, I know for me initially, when I came across that feeling, part of me kept saying, man, I wish I could change that. I wish I could change certain elements of my past in order to bring this what we're experiencing right now, what we've experienced for the past however many years, into my past, because it would change so much of it. But the reality of the matter, what I've realized, is that that's not given. Just because I'm able to experience all of this today, and if I'm able to bring those things into my past, it doesn't necessarily mean that the past is going to change, which goes back to an earlier point that I was making, and that's, it's difficult to figure out which of the choices should you change in order to change the outcome of your future. Because the past is the past, and if there's anything, the past is rich and it has a lot when it comes to it. So I share similar words that you do, Scott. I think this conversation really brought insights and perspectives that I personally was not aware of. And so I just want to thank everyone that's been a part of it. However, if there's one thing that I would change, it would be to leave a review through Facebook or LinkedIn, so that these conversations can spread even more to people who may not be aware of the fact that they exist. Would you change that?
I would, because you never know who might see them.
And that's the beauty, is like, you never know who might see them, and you never know how it might impact them in the moment.
One other thing that I would have changed would have been getting into podcasts earlier. So I would have heard your shows and had the opportunity to listen to them earlier in my life than I did. I had to wait until I knew you before I started listening to Overcoming Odds. So why don't you remove some of that challenge from the world for other people and talk to us a little bit about it?
Well, this is something that I started approximately, I think it's going on to 3 years. And really what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a space where people can have honest and transparent conversations about things that take place in everyday life, the circumstances, the challenges that people go through. And what I wanted to do is I really wanted to create this space where people can find the different lessons and takeaways from their hardships, the challenges, the obstacles that they face in life. And I figured, what better way to do it by traveling with them every step of the way. So choosing to share my own obstacles as I experience them, but also create a space for other people like you, like Jessica, and so many other people who have been a part of it. And what I found fascinating is that not only have I been able to see the transformation from other people, but I've also been able to see that transformation for myself. And I found tremendous meaning and a tremendous sense of purpose through my own journey of being able to find the different takeaways from those hardships. And I know you have too as well.
I agree. Kim, please put the URL for your podcast in the comments. Congratulations on your second anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
You were one of the first people that had me on as a guest. And as I mentioned earlier, I listened to that not that long ago and just loved your confidence. Jessica, you do the same. And Melody, again, please don't hesitate to write the links to some of your own articles as you publish them. We're a community here and we share and support each other. And I
Mm-hmm.
want that to always be there. Melody said that she found out about you through your TEDx talk. Oleg, that's very, very impressive. And she was ecstatic to be able to connect with you through LinkedIn. I'm ecstatic that Melody, you decided to come into our life as well.
Mm-hmm.
My podcast is Scott Mason's Purpose Highway at purposehighway.com, and we are exploring new movements for finding connection through the search for meaning as the institutions that have historically provided us with a sense of purpose, with an ethical foundation, as well as a sense of spirituality, are undergoing massive change. Fascinating guests, a profound topic, and we very much appreciate the support of everyone who takes the time to join that community as well.
Mm. Well, I guess if there's one thing that I could change in my life moving forward, and that is something that I wouldn't change, and that's people continuing to come and share these perspectives and insights every week. So I wouldn't change the time, I wouldn't change the platform, I wouldn't change anything about it. And I think with that said, this was quite the conversation, Scott, and I just appreciate you and the insights and perspectives that you bring each and every single time.
And I appreciate it too. One thing that will change, though, is that
Mm-hmm.
next week we will have one of our two other squirrels here. So be prepared for some interesting insight from that individual as well.
Mm-hmm.